My name is Afton, and I will be discussing the topic of internationalizing psychology. Hopefully by now you guys were able to read the 2 articles that I had assigned. I just want to say before I read these articles, I had no idea that the field of psychology was lacking such diversity. It's definitely not a topic that is discussed within classes and just in society in general. And I think because of this is the reason I thoroughly enjoyed reading these articles more than I thought that I would. Hopefully these articles opened your eyes to the dire need of internationalizing psychology beyond what has already been established. And I just want to say a little side note that these articles were published in 2008 and 2013. So obviously over the past 8 years, this information has changed some. Okay, so next I'm just going to be talking about internationalization and kind of what it means in terms of psychology. So internationalization is the concept that addresses how inclusive research is to all groups of people across the world. So basically, in other words, how well does this research apply to all people of different genders, race, religion, ethnicities, socioeconomical status, and so on? Much of the information discussed in these articles implies that majority of the research published within the American Psychological Association, or APA, mainly pertains to the American population, which is only 5% of the world's population. Occasionally, the research in the APA includes European countries and English-speaking countries as well, which I know 2 of them are Canada and New Zealand. And then I just want to ask the question of how can researchers argue the universality of their theories when it's only supported by 5% of the world's population? So next, I'm just going to be showing you guys a little bit of the statistics that are talked about within the articles. Okay, so now I'm just going to be talking about the statistics behind this research. To put things in perspective, these statistics show how the population of the US and other developed countries compared to underdeveloped and the developing countries in the world. Obviously, these statistics were published in 2008, so there's been a slight increase in population growth since the publication of this article. And at the time of these articles, the global population was at 6.5 billion, which is now 7.8 billion. And then the US population was 300 million, and it is now today at 331 million. With only 300 million citizens in America, we make up 5% of the world's population. So in bullet 3, I talk about the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And along with America, Canada, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand make up this organization. And together they are all calculated to have 1.2 billion people, averaging at a total of 18% of the global population. The population of these countries is projected to remain stable throughout the years, while other developing and underdeveloped countries are projected to grow by 50%. And I would definitely argue that this is probably because developed nations, just people are having less kids in general. And then the underdeveloped nations, people are having more and more kids. So the table to the right, figure 2, just kind of shows this, how the white bars are the less developed nations, and they are drastically growing over the next few years. And then the more developed, which would be the US and the different countries in the OECD, they remain pretty stable over the next couple of years. And then as you can tell, by 2050, there is said to be a global population of 9 billion. So I was just going to ask you guys the question of, if the United States only makes up 5% of the global population, why are American researchers so content with assuming that their research applies to the entire 95% of the world? And why does the APA suppress this issue? Because it's definitely not one that is discussed a lot. I was just going to say, in my own personal opinion, it kind of feels as if America sees ourselves as the elite, so why wouldn't these theories and discoveries be true for all non-Americans? I think this just kind of demonstrates how much bias there is within our own American research. And then next, I'm just kind of going to go into the APA journals that are discussed within the articles. In Arnett's article, he analyzed 6 different journals from the APA. They were Developmental Psychology, the Journal of Personality, Social Psychology, the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, the Journal of Family Psychology, Health Psychology, and then lastly, the Journal of Educational Psychology. I personally just appreciated that Arnett provided so much information on a broad range of journals. He didn't focus in on just one. It just honestly emphasized how much diversity, or the lack of diversity there is among these journals. And then I also think that these 6 journals are some of the most prominent subjects that create diversity, or that have the opportunity to create diversity if it was more implemented. And then he examined the countries of the first authors, other authors, and samples of each of these journals, which, not to my surprise, the US had the largest percentage in all 3 categories. And then 4 other English-speaking countries, and then Europe came in after the US. And so in the next 2 slides, I'm just kind of going to show you guys the tables from the articles to create a more clear picture of his findings. This is table 1 from Arnett's article, and if you guys look on the left side, you will see all 6 of the journals represented. And then the first row is first authors, the second row is other authors, and then the third row is the samples. And first we're going to focus on the first authors. So as you guys can see, that majority of the first authors are from the US, English-speaking countries, or European countries. With the exception of health psychology and educational psychology, there are practically no African, Latin American, or Middle Eastern first authors. And then if you go down to the second row of other authors, there's a little bit of an increase in other authors from Latin America for each journal, except for health psychology, but authors from African and Middle Eastern countries are hardly represented at all. And if we move down to the third row of samples, then you guys can see here there's a little bit of an increase in these numbers. But even with Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle Eastern, and Israel samples combined, they still do not exceed more than 10% of the total samples. And I just want to say that these statistics kind of demonstrate how underrepresented non-American populations are within the APA. This slide shows Table 2 and Table 3 from Arnett's article. Table 2 on the right gives the percentage of the European American samples in each of the 6 journals represented in the article. And obviously, as you guys can tell, these percentages do not fall below 60%, making it practically impossible for any country or combination of countries to exceed 40% of the represented samples. And then if you look to the left at Table 3, it's kind of the same thing as Table 1. It just is associate editors and then editorial board members and consulting editors for the APA. And it just kind of addresses the same issues that Table 1 did, and it follows almost the exact same trends, with practically all of the US and English-speaking countries and then Europe countries being represented, and practically no Asian, Latin American, African, or Middle Eastern, and even Israel in this case being represented. These 2 tables just kind of continue to show how skewed these journals are towards American research. So what factors cause diversity among humans? Obviously, there are a few ones that stand out the most, which would be your gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and socioeconomic status. But then both the articles also emphasize how income, health, education, and language are also large contributing factors to diversity. And I think in order to overcome these diversities, we must educate ourselves on these issues. I think a major problem in American society is schools, both grade and higher education, kind of fail to educate students on global issues. And so we tend to focus on just American issues, which kind of relates back to how the APA only publishes really American research. I kind of just all ties together at the end of the day. And if we require students to invest energy into learning about different cultures, then it would eventually become a norm to include non-Americans in research and just in daily life. So if we were to overcome these diversities, it would ultimately lead to more universal theories, research based on evidence instead of assumptions, provide us with a better balance between ethic and emic approaches, and encourage the recognition of global issues such as HIV, poverty, and terrorism, which at the time of these articles in 2008 and 2013, these were major global issues. And now we do have different issues such as COVID, for example. But with certain aspects of these diversities, each one is addressed by different fields of psychology. According to the 2 articles, there are limitations and strengths of According to the 2 articles, there are limitations and strengths of According to the 2 articles, there are limitations and strengths of According to the 2 articles, there are limitations and strengths of According According to the two articles, there are limitations and strengths of internationalization in each field of psychology listed below. I'm going to go through this list right here and just kind of give examples from the articles that discuss the diversity. Okay, so clinical psychology, it allows us to see differences among marital relationships. Obviously, here in the US, we see marriage as a romantic bond, while other cultures view it as a social arrangement. But one strength of clinical psychology is that it does use a universal approach to diagnose disorders. In social psychology, we use gender roles and stereotypes, and this kind of relates back to last class and women's roles in society. Obviously, in some cultures, women are still seen less than men, while here in the US, it's on its way up a little bit better. Women and men are kind of equal at this point. I just want to ask you guys the question of, do you think these societies view gender stereotypes as a setback? I would assume most Americans would disagree with these roles, and if so, could this be a reason why it's difficult for American researchers to research what we consider old views? Next is developmental psychology, and this kind of looks at the effects of peer relations in correlation with schools. And obviously, among different cultures, schools are very different. Some kids don't even attend school. Others, as here in the US, we continue to school for 15 plus years. And then family psychology just kind of covers the relationship with parents and parenting styles among children. And for one strength is that all parents seek to make sure their child can survive in society. And then health psychology, this kind of deals with health issues just in general, but also the articles discuss HIV and AIDS among the globe, which in US samples, this is mainly gay men, but in African samples, it's heterosexual women. So obviously this can cause discrepancies among research if both samples are not being addressed. And then lastly, educational psychology. This kind of talks about the teaching approaches that are among different cultures. So here in the US, we all go through grade school, we go through high school, most of us go to college. And then if you look over like in Europe, when they go through school, once they get to about middle school age, they go on like a trajectory path for what they would be best at, kind of like a specialized school. So obviously each field has come a long way in internationalizing psychology, but they can't have effectively claimed to internationalize psychology yet. But acknowledging the need for insight to other cultures is a step in the right direction. To start things off, I wanted to revisit some of the solutions the two articles offered. Both authors suggested to add new members to the journal editing boards. These new members should be of non-American descent, and hopefully by doing this, the APA would encourage non-American researchers to submit research. There would also need to be equal amounts of American and non-American research within the APA. APA could start this by having spotlights that highlight non-American research, and hopefully over time they would no longer need a spotlight because it would become the norm. If the APA were to do this, they would need to provide some support and guidance on journal etiquette to those unfamiliar with the process. Obviously, if you're not familiar with the journal etiquette process, then you would be intimidated to submit your own work. If psychology worldwide was able to connect and work as one, then new perspectives would emerge. Also, as I previously mentioned in this presentation, colleges should require students to take courses that expose them to different cultures, such as cultural psychology or anthropology. Lastly, studying abroad also provides real-life exposure and experiences to different cultures and diversities. Hopefully, this provides you guys with some solutions to these issues, and feel free to comment if you guys have any more ideas on these solutions.